Good evening. Hello. My name is Teresita Contreras, Pastoral Associate and Director of Religious Education. It is my pleasure to welcome you to St. Matthew's. Thank you for joining us tonight. I want to take this opportunity to welcome our parishioners, school parents, religious ed students and parents, catechists, those who join us from local high schools, neighboring parishes, and those watching us through our live stream. Over the past 30 years, Father Greg Boyle has transformed thousands of lives through his work as the founder of Homeboy Industries, the largest and most successful gang intervention program and reentry program. Homeboy became a worldwide force that helps previously incarcerated men and women redirect their lives. Father Boyle is the author of the 2010 New York Times bestseller, Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion. His new book, Barking to the Choir, The Power of Radical Kinship, was published in 2017. He has received the California Peace Prize and been inducted into the California Hall of Fame. In 2014, President Obama named Father Boyle a champion of change. He received the University of Notre Dame 2017, I'm going to say this right, Latrobe Medal, the oldest honor given to American Catholics. You may have noticed when you arrived this evening, we have provided contribution boxes and QR code if you would like to donate to this amazing organization. We are thrilled and honored to have Father Greg Boyle speaking to us this evening for the first time here at St. Matthew Catholic Church. Please join me in a heartfelt welcome, Stephanie, Ivy, and Father Greg Boyle.
Hi everyone, my name is Ivy and I was born and raised in West Los Angeles. I was raised by two drug-addicted parents. By the time I was 5, I had witnessed a lot of domestic violence, drug abuse from both of them. I had just seen a lot, stuff that an average 5-year-old shouldn't see, whatever average may be, but they divorced right after I was 5, a little after I was 5, and by the time I was 13, my mother had done the best she could to raise me alone as a single mother, but it was just hard for her, so I went to the streets, and I continued on the streets, on and off. I tried to make money to just survive, and by the time I was 26, I was blessed with my first son, but I had also done several jail terms, on and off. Like I said again, just trying to survive the streets and just trying to make it work for me and my son. So a little after my son was born, I was sentenced to 2 years in prison. So I went to prison, but I was also separated from my son, who was only 6 months old. It was hard for me, I didn't get any visits from him. I couldn't really bond with my son, and it was just hard because he was still a baby. But I got out determined. I was released determined to get him back and just try my best that I could in order to raise my son. I was released in 2011, and someone had told me about Homeboy Industries. They had mentioned Homeboy Industries to me. I had heard about it as I was growing up, but I just wasn't ready, up until that point. So at that point, I went to Homeboy Industries and I walked in there, and they said, what do you need help with today? And I said, I really need a job. And so they said, okay, go ahead and have a seat and go, you'll speak to Father Greg. So I looked towards his office, and he was sitting there with his array of people and, the usual stuff. And I stepped into his office, and he said, what can I help you with, kiddo? And I said, I need a job, G. And he said, okay. He gave me a start date, and I was hired in the Homegirl Cafe. I started working in the cafe. I thrived for about 2 years, But when I hit my 2-year mark, I put myself in a position where it was like the wrong place and the wrong time. And that landed me with a 60 years to life sentence, and I thought I would never, ever, ever come home. It was a real hard pill to swallow, not knowing if I was ever gonna get out again. And being separated from my son again, it really killed me, But it was something that happened, and I took my sentence with stride as best as I could. And I served 10 years off of that 60-year to life sentence. I wouldn't have pictures up of my son because I didn't want to be reminded of not being able to wake up next to him every day and not have him besides me. But, towards like the 6th year, I received good news from my appellate lawyer who said, you might be coming home. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't really wrap my mind around it. Like the whole time I kept some type of hope that I would come home one day, but I just couldn't really fathom it. So I kept on getting these letters, this legal mail, and okay, you might come home. But when the laws took in effect and they actually were in my favor, it was like, okay, I'm really gonna come home. In 2022, from one day to the next, they were like, you know what, you need to roll up your stuff and you're going out to court, you might not come back. I still couldn't wrap my head around it, but I did what I had to do. And last year, April 4, 2022, I was released after doing almost 10 years at a level 4 prison, being separated from my son, not being able to have any type of visits with him. Communication was very low between us, but now I was out. So the first place I went to was Boyle Industries, where I was greeted by family. Once again, I was home. I was home, and it was just a really good feeling because I thought I would never step back out into these streets again. Which now I get to enjoy life, but I went back to Homeboys. I got a job again, and now I'm working in the legal department at Boyle Industries. And I'm just trying to help the community with whatever they need, immigration services. Since I've been there in April, it's been hard because it was really hard to find housing, considering my background, my credit. I really didn't have any credit. There was no activity in the last 10 years. But I've attained housing. I am working on myself. I'm working on helping my community. I'm trying, my goal is to become a paralegal and just really move forward. I've been able to establish a relationship and bond more with my son, and that is what I'm doing now. So, it's just all about moving forward, and with Homeboys as my support system and with good people on my side, there's just no looking back. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Stephanie. I grew up in the projects, the parish where Father Boyle came to, where Miss Pat, your sister Pat, was my principal as a juvenile at Dolores Mission overnight. So it's a full circle right now seeing her. And I was not her easiest child to mingle with. At that time, I gave this lady a run for her money when I was younger. But like I said, I grew up in the projects where it was 8 gangs when Father Boyle came to my community. And at that point, there was no hope. We had no understanding to anything but just gang violence. And growing up, I chased my mother and my father in the streets. Multiple times I was raised by my grandmother. I love her to death, and she's my biggest inspiration and my biggest support system. But in the same token, I still was trying to linger around and follow my parents and trying to be accepted by them. So I chased them within the projects, and it led me down a route of me going to jail. I started my time at 12 years old, and that was my first time ever going to juvenile hall. From 12, was in and out, and then when I was 14, after I graduated from the Lord's Mission, I ended up catching a case, and it ended up sending me back to juvenile hall, and I ended up going to County Youth Authority. And Youth Authority basically is like a place where they set you up before you end up going to adults prison as a juvenile. And I spent time there, like I said, throughout my juvenile life, I was in and out of institutions and placements and camps and stuff. So once I ended up getting out of Youth Authority, my grandmother brought me down to Homeboy Industries. And my intentions was just going to just get my record expunged, but it seems to me that him and my grandmother had other options. They bamboozled me into getting me a job instead of me getting my record expunged as a juvenile. So G ended up seeing me, and my grandma was laughing and talking, and basically was like, hey, Pookie, you got a job, you start tomorrow. And I was like, yeah, no, I don't. I'm only just here just to get my record expunged. But more of the story is, I started working there. I started at Homegirls Cafe. That was my first job. I didn't know anything about service. I didn't know anything about talking to people. I was very inverted type person, and I always had this stink face on my face as I didn't want to be bothered, and I was unapproachable. And working there taught me how to be open with people and how to be receptive to other individuals in different races, in a sense. And it taught me how to be a woman at the end of the day and have responsibilities. But in the meantime of that, while I was still there, I ended up getting shot in 2008, and I woke up in ICU, and excuse me, so I don't like talking about it, but I woke up and I literally told the people that I was a John Doe because I didn't want my grandmother to come see me in a hospital bed. But come behold, I wake up in his Father Greg's little shiny little white beard, and my grandmother and my auntie standing there, and I literally like looked and like tried to close my eyes like I gotta be dreaming, but I wasn't. And just to like feel the love and the appreciation, like it wasn't like anything that I didn't do anything wrong, like they still seen the good in me in a sense. So moving forward, I ended up going back to Homeboys, still was working, and then I ended up leaving Homeboys and was working for a post-production company doing like visual effects on commercials and stuff. And you would have thought that my life was good. I've elevated and learned skills and stuff, but I had 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and I ended up getting sent to level 4 prison with Ivy, where she was at, and I got sentenced to 10 years. And out of 10 years, I did 8.5. Upon me coming home, I came home and I felt like I owed it to my grandmother and my auntie to be somebody different, not knowing that I owed it to myself in all actuality. So like once again, we came into the doors and Father Boyle opened us with open arms, gave us a hug. Hey kiddo, I love you. You start tomorrow type stuff. It was never like no wait and what do you need instantly. And an individual like me, we don't get that a lot. Like you don't get genuine, we don't have genuine people in our lives. So like I always said, Father Boyle's always been the water in the creek where I'm from in my projects, because all we had was just brick and concrete. So today, I'm senior staff at Homeboy Industries. I never thought I'd ever be a senior staff, and I work in the housing department, so I help my community clients and trainees like obtain housing. And there they call me, I'm like the muscle and the angel in disguise, because if you come to me, I'm gonna get it done instantly, and you're not gonna leave without feeling fulfilled, and you're not gonna leave without getting any type of help. And that's what Homeboys is all about, and that's what Father Greg is about. So at the end of the day, it's all we try to do is just follow his teachings and to be the beacon and show tenderness and love and kinship that I'm learning every day on how to be. But I'm blessed to be here, and I hope that our stories resonated with you guys. And just I thank you guys for listening to us and just having us here. And Sister Pat, I love you, and it's so good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Stephanie and Ivy. It's really been a privilege to spend these days with them. And Ivy had never been on a plane before, so that was interesting. And so then they saw all the things you see in San Francisco. So the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than these two women. So thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you for coming, and those of you at home on live streaming. You know, we're like 6 days into Lent, and I always think, when I think of Lent, I always think of a homegirl named Michelle, who walked into my office one day, and she said, "Well, it's official. I just found out my man's been cheating on me." I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry to hear that." I don't sweat it. I just went to church, got me them ashes, gave his ass up for Lent. That's the only Lenten story I have, but it's my favorite. In Lent, you're going to hear repent, and repent means move beyond the mind you have, which is a good way to situate repentance, to move beyond the mind you have. We're always being invited to do that, to grow and to somehow deepen. You know, you've come here tonight to St. Matt's, and what Martin Luther King says about church could well be said of your time here this evening. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to imagine a world that looks different, you know, and so you want to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. You want to go from this place to dismantle the barriers that exclude. You want to go from here so that you can stand out at the margins, because that's the only way they'll ever get erased, is if you stand out at them. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and we're invited to go from here to stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear, and those whose dignity has been denied. You're invited to go from here to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and to stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And we brace ourselves as we go out to the margins, because people will accuse us of wasting our time there. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And you go from here and other voices get heard. Well, none of that makes very much sense at all were it not for our notion of God that is spacious and expansive. And since we're in a church, I'm going to talk a little bit about God. You know, Meister Eckhart, who was a mystic who died in 1238 or something, he used to say that it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. Now, we don't quite believe that exactly, but I think that's the truth. I remember I had a spiritual director many years ago who said, "You know, we need a better God than the one we have." He was a Jesuit. But of course he's right, because otherwise you settle for a partial God, a puny God, a God created in my own image, rather than the other way around. And so somehow we want to move to what St. Ignatius of Loyola calls the God who's always greater. I remember I was at Juvenile Hall at San Fernando at Silmar, and I was in a gym, and there were like 500 gang members there. and I was wearing my alb and my stole, and I was sitting up on a little raised platform like this, and they had these sheets, and the sheets had the readings in them in Spanish and English. And sometimes when you preside, you kind of say, well, I'm going to close my eyes. I'm not going to read along. I'm going to listen to the word proclaimed by the homies who would come up and read. And the first guy came up and he read from the Old Testament. And then the second guy came up and did the responsorial psalm. And I had my eyes closed and I thought, well, this guy has really like an overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he gets up and he says, the Lord is exhausted. And I said, what the hell? And I look at this thing, and it was the Lord is exalted. And I remember thinking, wow, that's way better. Because we can connect to exhaustion, maybe not so much exalted. Because, you can exhaustion is about extension and going outside of yourself. And somebody asks you, how was your weekend? You said, ooh, I'm pooped. I'm exhausted, but I had the grandkids over. But, oh my God, it's a good tired. You get what that is. And so you want to there's nothing more consequential in our lives than the notion of God that we have. If it's puny, then you'll be puny. If it's spacious and expansive, that's how you'll be too. Because this is the place you go from to create a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. But the God who is huge and spacious. Last week was the anniversary of my mom's death. And I was on a Zoom with all my siblings. I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and they're all married. And so we had these little boxes on the Zoom, and we were remembering that she had died. She died like in the second term of Donald Trump, and so whatever year that was. And she was 92 years old, and she died as everybody wants to, in her own home, in her own bed, surrounded by her kids, sharp as a tack to the very end. In fact, she was watching the last year of her life so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she was not a lick afraid of dying. And I remember like a month before she died, she said to me, and she was just giddy and exhilarated, and she said, I've never done this before, which was something you might say just before skydiving. And as a matter of fact, the day before she died, I was sitting at the foot of her bed, which never happened where I was alone with her, because it was always millions of people. And she was asleep, and she opened her eyes and she saw me sitting there, and she said, oh, for crying out loud, and she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off because she hadn't died yet, and sorry. But the next day, again, as luck would have it, my sisters went out to get lunch, and it was exactly noon, and I was sitting at the foot of the bed, just me and her, and she lifts her head from the pillow, and she opens her eyes, and she lets out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us, and nobody in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I remember in the last weeks of her life, there'd be 3 or 4 or all 8 of her kids around her bed, and she'd be in and out of consciousness, and when she'd come to, she'd lock on to just one of us, laser beam focused, and with breathless delight, she'd say, you're here, you're here. And I remember when we buried her, I thought that may well be the singular agenda of our exhausted God, which is to look at us and say, you're here, you're here. So at Homeboy Industries, 10,000 folks a year walk through the doors, and we want to greet them and look them in the eye, and as the Buddhists say, "Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are." And we want to see them, and we want to welcome them to a safe place where they can be cherished, where people can repeatedly say, "You're here." Homies, folks who have been locked up for a long time, will say, "We're used to being watched, but we're not used to being seen." And that makes a difference, and that matters. So Homeboy Industries was started a long time ago when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. It had the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere. So we had 8 gangs at war with each other when I arrived as pastor, which is unheard of in public housing. Normally you have 1 gang. We had 8. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 257th a month ago. Not all from that community, but I know a lot of gang members and I get asked. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the projects. They were writing on the walls, they were selling drugs, they were violent. So I walked out to them and I would kind of isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, "Hey, if I found you a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, every single one said, "Yeah, you know, I would." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand a little bit. And right across the street from the church was our elementary school, Dolores Mission, grades K to 8, that occupied the first 2 floors. And then the entire 3rd floor was the convent. And so one night I gathered all the nuns together in the living room. I sat them down and I said, "Hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members." And they looked at each other and they went, "Sure." And that was the extent of their entire discernment process. And so then we were off and running. Gang members came from all 8 gangs, you know, to the church property. And it kind of created a disconnect. You know, people in the parish would sidle up to me and say, "Wow, you know, gosh, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? You know, good people in and bad people out." And I thought that was a good gospel challenge. And then the gang members said, "You know, if only we had jobs." And so myself and the women in the parish, was mainly women with children, was the profile of the parishioners. The women and myself, we marched around the factories that surrounded the projects trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started stuff, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center on the church property, all made up of rivals from these 8 gangs. Then in 1992, after the 4 police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King, every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles ignited, except for the poorest pocket, Dolores Mission. So the LA Times, a reporter came and she wanted to know why that was. And I said, "I don't know, maybe part of it was because we had 60 strategically hired rival gang members who had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community." So the article appeared the next day. Well, the following day, I was summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And I went to his office and he said, "How should I spend my money?" And as I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request. You know? I was young. I had hair. So it was, I said, well, you know, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from the school. You could buy it. It has ovens. They don't work, but you could fix them. I don't know, we could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members. They could bake bread. We could call the whole thing Homeboy Bakery. That was the extent of my entire business plan. So he said sure, and we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we became plural, we changed our name from Jobs for Our Future to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. And not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. You know, who knew people didn't want gang members in their homes? You know, I did not see that coming. And now nobody ever intends to do such a thing. We evolved. We backed our way into becoming now the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program on the planet. So 10,000 folks walk through the door hoping that someone will look at them and say, "You're here, you're here." Every single one of them walks through the doors barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace. And the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. Every single one walks through those doors with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. At Homeboy, we're allergic to the idea of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up, mainly because our exhausted God never does such a thing. Instead, we hold up the mirror and we tell people the truth, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them, and then we watch them become that truth. We watch them inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But you always have to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that keep people from seeing their truth. You know, I'm a Jesuit, and you know, like the Pope. I'm just saying, and the homies don't really know what a Jesuit is, and so we have like 3 Jesuits who work there, and but it's not kind of part of the lexicon exactly. And I remember one day I was sitting in my office, and in front of me were 3 folks I was having a meeting with, and my office is glass enclosed, so I can see out onto the whole floor. You know, it's packed with gang members wanting to either get tattoos removed in our clinic or talk to Stephanie about getting a place to live, or get in our 18-month training program, or go up to Ivy's department and try to get their record expunged. They're all waiting for something, and I'm behind my desk talking to these 3. And we have tours all the time, tour groups from everywhere, high schools, colleges, delegations from Australia. All over the world and all over the country, people come to see Homeboy Industries. It's huge, our headquarters. And we have 11 social enterprises, so bakeries, restaurants, you name it. And so this whole tour group of about 20 just park themselves in front of my glass enclosed office, and I kind of wave weakly, and it's one of those observe our founder in his natural habitat. And the tour guide is Osvaldo, and Osvaldo has what the homies call a loud ass voice, you know, and And he says, and this is Father Greg Boyle. He is the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest. So from my desk, I'm kind of doing my best, most unimpressive moves. Well, I told you that because on February 27th, 1544, St. Ignatius of Loyola enters in his spiritual diary this word for the first time. And he proceeds to use it for the remaining 12 years of his life until he died. And before he died, he went back and he circles the word. Now, I speak Spanish, but I'd never heard of this word before. And the word is acatamiento. Acatamiento. And it comes from a kind of an archaic word, acatar, which means to look at something with attention. And it gets translated as affectionate awe. And sure, it was born of a mystical moment between Ignatius and his God, but he didn't want to settle for a mystical moment. He held out for a stance in the world, a movement, really. Affectionate awe. Which reminds me of the Acts of the Apostles, where it talks about, has this one odd line, and awe came upon everyone. And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was what we call in the biz a gang in-service. So 600 social workers, they commandeer this hotel ballroom, they sign in, get their 3 credits, they go to workshops, breakout sessions, keynote addresses. I'd done a lot of these, and I figured, I would do a keynote or something, so I said yes, and I bought my plane ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pull out the letter inviting me, and to my horror, I discover that I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself, oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. So I pulled 2 homies in, Andre and Jose. They're from enemy neighborhoods, African American and a Latino. And they're in their 9th month of their 18-month training program. And I sat them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories before, and Jose gets up first, and he's 25 years old, and he's, been to prison, a shot caller, tattooed, gang member. At that moment in his 9th month, he was, a very valued member of our substance abuse team. So everybody moves around, different phases, different things, and so he was not only at this moment he was helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues, but not only had he been in prison and a gang member, he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasp. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And then they went from gasp to laugh, and we got whiplash. And then he continued. I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days till my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. And my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. Acatamiento, affectionate awe. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And this evening, and this event, is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from, to welcome your own wounds, to create a community of kinship such that God might recognize it, and that we all might take seriously what Jesus took seriously, which, lucky for us, are only 4 things: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. Let me end with this. Sometimes it occurs to universities or even high schools. We were at St. Ignatius today, to force their students to read my books against their will. The junior class there has to read Tattoos on the Heart. And so I remember I got a phone call from my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, who ruins my brackets every March Madness. And so they were forcing their incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart, and so they said, would you come up and speak to 1,000 people on a Tuesday night? And I said, sure. And they said, could you bring 2 homies with you? And I do, if people ask, and normally I would pick 2 enemies, rival gang members, just to force them to share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of watching gang members panicked in the sky. And so I picked 2 homies. I picked Larry, an African-American gang member, and I picked Mario. And I'm used to nervous Nellies, But Mario was the most terrified homie I'd ever flown with. It was kind of starting to freak me out a little bit. He was hyperventilating, which I'd never seen before, you know. And we hadn't even boarded the plane yet, you know. And so we were at Burbank Airport, which is a smallish airport, and they don't have the jetway, you know, the hermetically sealed chute to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac, you know, like you're the president, and you climb up the steps to go to the front of the plane. Big feature at Burbank, steps to go to the back of the plane. And I'm sitting there with Mario, and Larry's off exploring the airport, and it's early morning and first flight of the day, and our flight crew arrives, and I see two female flight attendants with very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps to board the plane. And Mario goes, "When are we going to board the plane?" I said, "Well, you know, as soon as they sober up the pilots." There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that Mario, and you'll agree with me, I think, on this, in the history, 35-year history of Homeboy, Mario's the most tattooed individual who has ever worked there. He's all sleeved out to his fingertips, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin,